All right, this is lecture 4.2, and it is now that we've covered borders and shapes of states and how those can impact the people living there. We're going to look at the types of countries, the makeup of different types of countries, and the ways that they can be governed. Okay, so often we use the word nation kind of to mean the same thing as a country, and that's not necessarily the case. If you think like one nation under God, we throw around the word nation. Nation just refers to a group of people with a common ancestry, culture, or language that inhabit a particular area. So the U.S. really isn't a nation, and we'll get into what we are. Examples would be like the Cherokee Nation, the Navajo Nation, the Kurds. Some nations do have a country, and we'll talk about what that is called in a moment, but many do not, and we'll talk about that. So a nation state is a recognized sovereign state, so using that word sovereignty from last lecture, that has a homogeneous population, okay? So Japan, Iceland, South Korea, for example, those countries are 90% ethnically or racially, nationally, kind of that country's ethnicity, race, nationality, that they are not very diverse. They are not heterogeneous, okay? So that is a nation state. A stateless nation, and many nations kind of classify as stateless nations. For example, the Palestinians, the Kurds, the Penobscot, the Cherokee, the Navajo, for example. Those are all nations of people who do not have their own recognized sovereign state. Wales, North Ireland, the members of the United Kingdom are all technically stateless nations, though often when we're talking about stateless nations, we use it more often to refer to people who are a nation of people and want voice, want self-government, want agency, but don't necessarily have it. Whereas like Wales and Northern Ireland, with the whole UK system, they are technically stateless, but they do have they have representation within the UK government system. So they are less like the stateless nations like the Palestinians or the Kurds, who get much less voice and self-government. But they technically are all stateless nations. Okay? There are also multinationals, and that is us. So it's a sovereign state with two or more large ethnic groups or nations. So states that are very diverse. So the US, Canada, Russia, most of South America, and most of Africa except for one country are multinationals, especially, they were already ethnically very diverse even before colonizers came in, and then with colonization and colonization bringing with it enslaved people, those two continents are particularly diverse racially, ethnically, and with their nationalities. So both South America and Africa with the exception of one, are all multinational countries. They do not have any nation states. Again, Africa's got one exception to that, because all of their states have very diverse, heterogeneous populations. Okay? All right, moving on to the types of governments that countries will have. So a unitary state, the definition of this, so some countries have a unitary state, and it's a single central government holds most of the power. So it's a very centralized government system. Doesn't mean it's democratic. It could be democratic. Some are. It could be a dictatorship, authoritarian. It just means that the central government holds most of the power. They might have some provinces, and those provinces have some local self-government, but there is less power devolved to those lower regional or local units. So they get less power, less decision-making at the local and regional level. So this is best suited for compact, small or homogeneous countries. So it's very hard to centralize all your power in one place and control everything. It's easier when your country is small or where it's not a very diverse population. And so when you make centralized, kind of standardized decisions, that can typically work more often. So examples, Iceland, Kenya, France is a unitary state. So these places are democratic, but they have a central government. They don't give a lot of power out to their local, regional, as much power out to their local or provincial level governments as you would experience in like the United States. Okay. Federal states is a system where the power decisions are shared between the national, so a federal government, and regional, usually state or provincial government. So if you think about like how much power state governments have here in the United States, we are a great example of a federal state system where the federal government does have some powers, but the state governments make a lot of different decisions. And think about how, like, from state to state, taxes are different, gun laws are different, abortion laws are different, education is funded differently, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So a place that is unitary, there would be less regional variation in laws. A federal state, there's going to be quite a lot of difference between each state or province because of how much local decision making is happening. Okay, so this is best suited for countries that are geographically large or are very diverse, so they need a lot of different voices represented. Also, countries that have had a history of authoritarian governments. So Germany is on the smaller side compared to like the United States, Canada, or Australia. Germany, because of its history with Hitler and the Nazis, has a federal state. So when you see maps of Germany, it's asking what would you guess? Again, some smaller countries that have a history of central governments that abused their power have deliberately chosen to be federal, despite the fact that they don't necessarily need to be based on their size. Okay, so Canada, massive, Australia, massive, Russia, US, these places are massive and very diverse. It would be impossible in some of these places to have a central government making all the decisions and trying to make those decisions uniform across the states. Okay, all right. There are also colonies, so some countries have colonies, and you can see on this map all the like tealish to blue are countries that were colonized or controlled by Europe, or partially controlled or colonized. The tiny little orange are the ones that were never colonized by Europe. So it's not a lot, but a colony is a country that's been taken over and occupied by another country, usually a distant one. Obviously, all the British colonies in North America and the rest of the world. The Spanish colonies in Central and South America, Portuguese colonies. So colonization was much more prevalent historically because of the distaste for that and that the brutal history that most of those colonies experienced. The word colony is not really used. So there are countries that still technically have colonies, but they like to call them their territories or other words to make it not sound like a colony. But there are still countries in the world that own other distant countries. They just don't necessarily call them colonies. So for example, the US, we have several territories like Puerto Rico, Guam, American Samoa, etc. We don't call them colonies. They are territories, but they don't get full representation or fair funding and rights, etc. So very much like a colony, except we're not applying the word colony to them. Greenland, Western Sahara is a contested area, New Caledonia, the Falklands, lots of different places that are, you can see again the different places are highlighted here, many of them islands. That are not technically colonies but feel very colony-ish. Okay. For a history of where colonization, we're going to be looking at lots of borders where decolonization did not work out so well. The Berlin Conference was a meeting in the mid-1880s where it divided up and then redrew all the borders of African countries. And this had a strong history, so that colonial history had a strong influence on the borders of Africa. And so you can see here all the lines that were drawn. They did not consider necessarily ethnic lines, religious lines. They were, again, looking out for European interests. And so this has created conditions, so some of these borders still exist today, lumping in different groups of people who maybe already had conflict or was cutting ethnic groups in half. Anyways, it's created conditions for decades, hundreds of years at this point of conflict depleted resource, a false division within countries. So the Berlin Conference is one of the worst examples of colonization and its impact on borders, particularly in this case in Africa. Again, many of those borders still existing that we were looking at on previous days. Okay. Neocolonialism is where you use political or economic power to pressure or control another country. So without actually controlling the country like previous colonization, now it's using your political or economic power to pressure that country. So the U.S. in Vietnam, the U.S. in the Cold War, using money all over the world to influence countries to try to be on our side versus Russia's side. China's current system, the Belt and Road, especially in Africa and the Middle East, trying to gain or increase China's influence within those regions and pushing U.S. influence out. So while they're not physically taking over land, they are using especially economic power to pressure countries to be in alliances or be on their side or to do what they would like. Okay. Last one is challenges to these governments that can lead to borders or not, new borders or not. So devolution is this key word, and this is where it is power is transferred from some central power to a more regional or local power. Sometimes that means a new country or new borders are created. Sometimes it's just handing power down, no new borders are created. Okay, examples of forces, devolutionary forces, to use the kind of key word, would be different language groups. So if you think about like Belgium or Quebec, those led to some devolution of power to give those language groups, people of those language groups, some more self-governance. There's all kinds of ethnic tensions or ethnic diversity that would lead to a government giving more power to particular ethnic groups. Isolation can also lead to the devolution of power. So if a area of a country is particularly geographically isolated, the central power might devolve some power to that place, giving it more autonomy, more self-government. So for a long time, Tibet had a little bit more self-governance. That is declining, but that would be a good example of an area that was more geographically isolated, that did have some self-government, some power was devolved. Again, that's being reversed. Economic inequality can drive this, religion. So because of religious differences, in the case of like Israel-Palestine, Israel might one day decide, or had until recently, devolved some power to the West Bank and Gaza, some self-government to the Palestinians, various Palestinian groups. That has been taken away. So just because power has been devolved does not mean it stays devolved. But to devolve power just means to give more regional or local power in order to kind of maintain peace or cohesion, something like that. Okay. Some examples. The UK has devolved some power to like Wales, Scotland, etc. Like I said, Belgium, Spain has given some self-government to its regions that are, some are geographically isolated, some are linguistically quite different and or ethnically different, and see themselves as separate, as a separate nation from Spain. So they have devolved power versus like giving them full independence and freedom. In the case of the USSR, so former Soviet Union, Russia, they actually broke up back into a variety of nations, many of them nation states. So that devolution of power literally led to new borders and new countries, new nation states. Okay. Last term is Shatterbelt. And this is a strategic area that is caught between two larger powers and has a lot of internal conflict. So it's not necessarily, the strategic area isn't necessarily one country, it could be many countries, but it's an area where more than one power is interested in that area. So Eastern Europe, especially during the Cold War, a little less so, so I guess somewhat so now, even still with Ukraine. The Middle East is another area, so when it's in between, for the last 70, 80 years between kind of Western Europe, US united versus Russia. That is what these areas are still caught between. So shadow belt can refer to a smaller region. The classic examples, though, are big regions like the Middle East or Eastern Europe that are these often much smaller countries that are caught, so they're shattered. They are caught between two bigger powers that are trying to get influence in that particular area. Right now, Africa, the whole continent of Africa would not really count as a shadow belt, but a similar kind of competition is happening between Western Europe, US, and especially China for influence, spheres of influence within Africa. But Africa would be quite large to consider a shatter belt, but it's a similar concept. Middle East, Eastern Europe, best concepts there. That is it for this lecture. Make sure you go and take care of the quiz.